welcome to another episode of Hope in the Time of Corona. Today is Sunday, and so we are continuing our series in Judges. And what I'd love to do is give you some time to go and read Judges 14 and 15. I'm not going to be able to read it today, but I think it's really worthwhile taking a minute or 5 to have a read of these 2 chapters so that when I give you a summary, you have a sense of what's been going on. So I'm going to pause here and I will see you in 5 minutes. Great. Well, hopefully now you've had a chance to read, and if you have read it and you had a reaction anything like mine, you might be thinking, oh, what is this? And particularly, what on earth is going on with Samson? And maybe, what on earth is going on with God in these 2 chapters? If you didn't have a chance to read it, I'm going to do my best to give you a summary, but it is going to be brief. I tried to write it out in a sentence or 2, and this is what I came up with. We meet Samson as an adult. He claims a wife, kills a lion, deceives his parents, makes and loses a bet, loses his wife in rage, defeats the Philistines in anger and revenge, escapes captivity from his own people, complains to God and gets a drink, and then judges for 20 years. I'm going to read that one more time. We meet Samson as an adult. He claims a wife, kills a lion, deceives his parents, makes and loses a bet. He loses his wife in a rage. He defeats the Philistines in anger and revenge. He escapes captivity from his own people. He complains to God, who gives him a drink, and then he judges the Israelites for 20 years. It's quite the story of mess. Samson is a mess. And yet, there are also these points in the passage that say the Spirit of the Lord, or it was his parents didn't know it was the Lord's doing when it comes to talking about the wife. So this is strange interaction of this messy, angry, kind of petty, arrogant, vengeful Samson and God. And it feels like they don't really go together. And what I want to do today is have a little explore about how it is that Samson might be as angry as he is, where God is, how come he's still there, and what that might mean for us. So Samson is a mess. And I think what's interesting is similar to the story of Jesus that we have, the account of Jesus's life in the New Testament, we skip from Samson's birth to his adulthood. We get one incident for Jesus about him being 12 years old in the temple, but other than that, we pretty much go from Jesus's birth to his adult life, and it's the same for Samson. So if you remember back to last week and Matt talking about the encounters that the angel of the Lord had with both Samson's mum and Samson's dad, telling them about the way that Samson would be set apart for God. Samson's mum, this unnamed woman, takes on the Nazirite vow in her pregnancy. She says yes to God. She agrees to follow him and bears a son who she knows will be set apart as a judge over Israel, as a deliverer for Israel, a redeemer for Israel. Samson's dad has a slightly rockier road to accepting what might be happening. He thinks about this angel of the Lord, and to be honest, it seems like he's a bit sceptical. It's not until after he's flown up in some smoke and fire that he believes that it is the angel of God. Before then, he thinks that he needs to bargain with this God. The culture has told him that gods don't dish out grace. They don't give gifts freely. You have to kind of wheedle your way in, make a deal to save yourself later. And Samson's born into this, and then we don't see him again until he's an adult. And then as an adult, what we read is that he goes to a place where the Philistines, who are currently occupying Israel, so they're in charge over Israel, he goes to this village, sees a woman, thinks, I'll have her. And this whole story begins with him choosing a wife on the basis of her looking good in his eyes. And it flows then outwards, and we just see this ongoing spiral of rage from Samson. And he tears a lion to pieces, which breaks his Nazirite vow of touching the dead. He also, by deceiving his parents, not telling them about what he's done and giving them honey from the carcass of the lion, also means that they break their vow. So he shows very little respect for the Nazirite vow that he's made. And he's petty and vengeful. He makes a bet with his new in-laws, which he proceeds to lose. And then it takes out his rage on them, to the point at which his new father-in-law thinks that he hates his daughter. The father-in-law thinks that Samson hates his new wife so much that he gives her away to someone else. That's pretty bad. There's just a catalogue of disasters, which ends with his own people, the tribe of Judah, taking him captive, giving him over to the Philistines, God intervening so the ropes melt off him like wax. And then Samson complains to God about his experience. God gives him a drink, and he goes on in the last verse of the chapter to judge over Israel for 20 years. And I have to be honest and say that when I read that, the first thing that I thought is, I'm not sure that Samson is cut out for judging Israel. Like, this is a man who is full of rage and anger. And then I started to kind of wonder why. Why was he so full of anger? And I had 3 thoughts. One, if you look in these 2 chapters about the people of Israel, and specifically we see this example towards the end where the tribe of Judah are willing to give Samson over to the Philistines, basically to keep the peace. What it tells us is that they are not interested in being liberated. Sophie told us right back at the beginning of the series that Judges is a story of a cycle. The people of Israel doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking away from him, realizing their mistakes, coming back in repentance, a judge coming to liberate them, then remembering God for a while, and then falling again into doing evil in the eyes of God. And this cycle has gone round. And at the beginning of the series, Sophie really helpfully described this not only as a cycle, but as a spiral, that it not only goes round, but it goes down. It gets worse as the journey through Judges goes on. And here we are, the last judge, Samson, and we're in the pit from an Israelite perspective, because they don't even want to be liberated. There is no sense whatsoever that they recognise that they may have gone wrong away from God. They might be doing their own thing. There's no sense that they need or want liberation. And so Samson, what does he do with that? He was born to liberate Israel. An angel of the Lord. Imagine the stories that he's told, especially by his mum, who's taken on this Nazirite vow herself. He's never cut his hair. He sticks out like a sore thumb. As he gets older, he can't go out drinking with his friends. He can't touch anything dead. He sticks out. His whole life, he's had this sense of calling, of purpose. And yet everyone around him in his own people is like, I don't mind. What are you talking about? I think that has consequences. We don't get to see the intervening period between Samson being born and this incident, this catalogue of destruction starting. But it doesn't take me much imagination to imagine that that wears you down. If you grow up with a sense of calling, a sense of knowing your identity, your purpose in life, and everyone around you is less sure, then that wears down your certainty, your security. Secondly, his dad, as we discussed earlier, had very much taken on the ideas of the culture around him, to take on this notion that gods were to be bargained with. They weren't really to be trusted, that if they did something good for you, they'd expect you to do something for them later. That was all about deal making to keep yourself on the right side of God. And as Matt said, Manoah, Samson's dad, just didn't know God. He didn't understand who God was. And although Samson has been set apart and blessed, and he has a mother who says yes to God, we know from that experience that Samson is also immersed in a culture, immersed in a world that doesn't know God, doesn't understand that God wants relationship, that God looks to meet with us where we are. And if you think that God is about bargaining and making your ploy or getting on the right side of him, and he's given you some gifts, that must make you feel quite good about yourself. You can imagine Samson sort of feeling like he might be a cut above the others, right? He's set apart and gifted. Because this God who's a bargainer, he's like set my favour on him, so I must be on his right side. It's not about relationship, it's about kind of status and power. So, Israel don't even want liberation. But Samson knows he is set apart. And over time you can see these two things, this kind of culture of growing up in not understanding the importance of relationship, and this idea that no one around him thinks that they need liberating, so all the gifts that he has are slightly wasted. You can see what that could do and does do to Samson. What it does is push him into isolation. There are three really key relationships I think we see this in, apart from God, who I will come back to, with people. One, his parents. He just doesn't listen to their wisdom. They are concerned that he wants to marry a Philistine. They think that he would be better off marrying someone from his own people, as is the kind of culture and tradition at that time. And so they're a bit worried, and he is just absolutely dismissive of them. Secondly, when he goes to marry this Philistine woman, what they say is that her family, her tribe, brought companions. And what that implies to me is, I don't think Samson's got any friends. He's a loner. And actually later we learn that when Samson's enraged to the point at which his bride's father thinks that Samson hates her and gives her away, he gives her away to the companion that was his best man. And his best man was exactly that, just a companion from the tribe. Samson doesn't have anyone in his life, special, friendship-wise, to be alongside him, to live alongside him. And thirdly, in a human way, we see it in his relationship with his bride-to-be. He literally, well, in my translation, whether he literally said this in Hebrew or not, I don't know, but he literally says in my translation, now go get her. Like, I want to possess her. She looks good to me. I will have her. He has this fundamental misunderstanding of what God has created marriage for. We know in Genesis that God calls us to leave our parents and cleave to our spouse. And there's loads more I could say about marriage, even though I am not married, because the vision of a biblical marriage is really clear. And Samson's just all about possession, potentially political move. There's a sense where getting in with the Philistines will help to overturn them, for the Israelites to be back in charge again. So it might be a political move, but either way, it's not really what God would hope for in a marriage. He doesn't get to know her, he literally just looks at her. And I recognise, of course, that culturally we're in a completely different world now, but I think it still stands that God would hope for more in marriage, even in the time of the judges. So Samson dismisses the wisdom of his parents. He doesn't really have friends to stand by him, and he misunderstands what marriage might be. He isolates himself from people. And I think what that does is to bed in the fear and the anger. If you don't know that the gifts that you have are actually for the world right now, for the world that you believe you were called to, then you're going to get scared that maybe you were wrong. And there's a psychologist in America who I have a lot of respect for. She spent her life studying anger, and I thought of her when I read this passage of Samson because he's angry throughout. And she says, anger is a signal and one worth listening to. What she's saying, I think, is that anger is a sign of something else going on underneath, and we do well to listen to it to help us to understand where to go next. And I think that the sign for Samson of anger is belying this underroot, this undercurrent of fear, this worry that actually he wasn't made for a time such as this, or his gifts aren't really what they're there for. And what we see then is this fearful response leading him to push into isolation and use his gifts in a kind of abuse of power. And this is where I want to talk a bit about God. Because if you've read the passage like me, you'll see that there are some key points where it talks about the Spirit of the Lord. And there's one little bit at the end where we hear Samson talking directly to God. He moans and God gives him a drink. And it can be quite a confusing picture because it seems as though the Spirit of the Lord, and it does, comes on him. They describe the Spirit of the Lord coming to him, particularly in the moments of anger and destruction. Destruction that in one part of the 2 chapters leads to 1,000 people being killed at Samson's hand. He has gone so far down the road of anger, and yet God is there. And I think everything in me wants to say, but surely God is a God of justice and mercy. And he doesn't want 1,000 people to die because of Samson's mistakes, his mess, his anger, his fear. And I think that's true. But I think also that God is gracious and he's faithful. And he's faithful to the promise that he made to Samson's mum and to Samson at the very beginning of his life. Tim Keller talks about God using Samson despite his difficulties. And I see what Tim is trying to say, but I would want to push it a little further and suggest that God is using Samson within his difficulties. God meets us exactly where we are, in exactly the trouble that we are in right now. In some ways, when you read this, Samson is this kind of abhorrent, arrogant, violent man who you just cannot imagine being in charge of any people. And then you spend a minute reflecting on yourself and the mess that I have made in my life of relationships and other people. And I realise that I'm no better. And yet I hope and believe that God in his gracious mercy will use me. And I think that is God's Spirit showing up in this passage. I think there's more to say about so much of this. There's so much richness in these 2 chapters, and Samson is an example of someone who's gone so far off on a little tangent or a big deathly tangent, and it's really difficult to read. But I think we also have some beautiful parallels for what hope we have in Jesus. Just as Samson was set apart to liberate Israel, Jesus was set apart to save the world. And just as Israel didn't care whether they were liberated, we crucified Jesus. We didn't even realise who he was. And the thing that's then different, which is hopeful for us, is that the similarities between Samson and Jesus pretty much end. Because Samson is operating from a place of fear, of anger, on the foundations of fear. Jesus is operating from a place of love and forgiveness. There is much kind of academic wisdom in the world that says that the opposite of love is not hate, as most of us automatically think. The opposite of love is fear. Samson doesn't realise how loved he is, and that degrades over time his character, the person that he is, and it spills out into these deathly, angry actions. Jesus knows exactly who he is. He knows he is loved, and he knows how to love. Where Samson pushes into his fear and frustration and isolates himself more and more from others, Jesus recognises his position as God's son and spends as much time with him as he can. He separates himself out from the crowd to pray. But not only does he separate himself out to pray with God, he takes his disciples with them. He's invested in relationship with people. Samson ignores the vow that he made because it's just too painful to look at. He's not supposed to touch dead things, and yet he rips a lion to shreds, then goes back the next day and digs the honey out of the carcass. And you could treat that as complete disregard for his vow, and I think to a degree that it is, but I wonder also if it's fear that's just separated himself out. He can't look at what it would mean to follow that vow because it's so painful that no one else understands. Jesus is in Gethsemane asking whether there is any other way, and yet he says, "Not my will, but yours, God." In the end, Samson is operating from a place of scarcity, an idea that there is a limit to God's power, to God's grace, to God's love. And Jesus models to us a different way, that there is abundance of love, abundance of grace, abundance of forgiveness, abundance of mercy. And from there, all life comes. And I just wanted to end here with a note about relationships, because this is big, heavy stuff, and all of us feel in one way or another ill-equipped to manage our fear. And if you're thinking about your fear today and wondering, oh my gosh, how am I managing? How am I going to live? How am I going to allow Jesus to speak to me in love and not fear? Then I'd love to encourage you to think about the people that you have around you and the gifts that they are that God has given you. And I'm going to do that by reading to you a short passage from Henri Nouwen, who was a theologian, an academic, a professor who lived this incredible life of service. And he says this: human intimacy creates a home for God. Marriage is not a lifelong attraction of two individuals to each other, but a call for two people to witness together to God's love. The intimacy of marriage itself is an intimacy that is based on the common participation in a love greater than the love two people can offer each other. The real mystery of marriage is not that two people love each other so much that they can find God in each other's lives, but that God loves them so much that they can discover each other more and more as living reminders of God's divine presence. They are brought together indeed as two prayerful hands extended toward God and forming in this way a home for God in this world. The same is true for friendship. Deep and mature friendship does not mean that we keep looking each other in the eyes and are constantly impressed or enraptured by each other's beauty, talents and gifts, but it means that together we look at God who calls us to God's service. As we read Judges together today, let's reflect on the reality of fear in our lives, the invitation to love, and the tools and the people that God has given us to work out our salvation together. I look forward to seeing you at the Zoom debrief at 11 if you can be there. See you soon. Bye.